Hi, everyone. How are y'all? Good? We're going to go ahead and get started. So today we have, and welcome to the session, but we have this session called Leading with Clarity, Navigating Conflict and Organizational Change, and it's going to be led by Debbie Tacke and Katie Richards. So if you could please give them a very warm welcome, and then I'm going to go ahead and pray for us. If you could bow your heads, please. Dear God, I thank you so much for this day and just for the opportunity that we have this week and this weekend to gather and to understand more of who you are, your heart for us and your heart for people as patients, as clinicians, as administrators. And God, I just pray that in this time you will open our hearts to whatever it is that you want to reveal to us about who you are and about what our vocation might be within your work on this earth in restoring brokenness to wholeness. And I pray over Debbie and over Katie that you will be with them and give them wisdom and insight and clarity and peace as they share. So I thank you for all these things, and I pray that you'll bless our time. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, hi, everyone. Good to see you all. My name's Debbie Tacke, and I provide leadership coaching and consulting for faith-based ministries and organizations. And I've been around CCHF for a long time, actually, back when the conference was in Nashville at Belmont. And I've been here as a part of my work with women in medicine at Vanderbilt, and then also through my work with Siloam Health in Nashville. So the motivation for my work is to see Christian leaders grow in their capacity to connect their belief in the gospel with their lived experience of relational health. One of the things I've observed about Christian leadership through the years, and I've been around Christian leadership for a long time, I'm a pastor's kid, so I've seen a lot of Christian leaders over the years, and one thing I've realized is that it's one thing, and I know this from my own life as well, it's one thing to talk about the power of the gospel to transform our lives, and it's another thing to actually engage in the lifelong process of being transformed. So in other words, the evidence of our spiritual growth and maturity is reflected in our relationships. And leadership is one of the primary places where that gets revealed. So today's session is really an orientation to looking at how growth happens in the relational systems in which we live. So the context for today's conversation is going to be your healthcare clinics. But everything we're going to talk about today is applicable to every other relational system in your life, your families, your communities, your churches. But we're going to talk about it in the context of your healthcare clinics. So I want to briefly talk about anxiety to start with, because anxiety is the context in which leadership always operates. So when I use the word anxiety, I'm not talking about emotional fragility or some kind of pathology. I'm talking about an automatic response to real or imagined threats. So in other words, when something we care about is threatened, we feel anxiety. And that shows up in high-functioning, strong organizations, and it shows up in struggling organizations because it's a human response to uncertainty and change. So what that means is anxiety is part of every system, and it's contagious. It moves quickly through systems, and it almost always moves toward leadership, because leadership roles sit in the middle of competing pressures. So between getting work done and supporting the people who do that work, between outside expectations and internal realities in the organization, between priorities that don't always align. So because of that, leaders often become containers for anxiety that they didn't personally create. And when anxiety increases, leaders often feel pressure to act quickly, to have answers, to absorb frustration, and to stabilize others. Does any of that sound familiar? Can I get an amen? So, for example, when there's rising anxiety and pressure, leaders often feel an increased sense of urgency. Everything starts to feel time sensitive, even things that normally wouldn't. We often feel a temptation or a tendency to step in more quickly than usual. So we find ourselves answering more questions, making decisions, or solving problems that maybe other people could and should do and make, but we do it because it feels faster and safer. We feel a tendency to carry more internally, to feel responsible for holding information so that other people don't get overwhelmed. We have a tendency to become more reactive to tone or behavior, so comments or actions that normally wouldn't bother us suddenly have more charge. We have a tendency to avoid certain conversations when we're under increased pressure and anxiety because it just feels like one more thing that I just don't have the capacity for right now. We have a tendency to narrow our focus, so we concentrate on what's immediately right in front of us instead of thinking more about the long-term health of the organization. We have a tendency to experience physical symptoms, tightness in our body, difficulty sleeping, feeling keyed up or depleted. And we often have a tendency to try to meet multiple expectations all at once. So saying yes to competing demands, trying to keep everybody satisfied, even though we know that's not sustainable and workable. So the thing is, most of these anxiety-driven behaviors bring about some kind of short-term relief. They make us feel better in the short term, but they have a long-term cost. So, for example, stepping in quickly can relieve discomfort, but it can train dependency in the organization. Avoiding conflict can keep the peace, but it can come at the cost of clarity about what we're doing and why. Taking responsibility for everything can feel stabilizing, but it can exhaust leaders and weaken the system. So in the moment, these moves feel necessary and they feel responsible. They feel like we're being good leaders if we do these things because we're taking care of things. But over time, they increase anxiety in the system. So the bottom line is, for our conversation today, anxiety is not a problem we're going to try to eliminate. We can't eliminate it. As long as we're talking about human beings here, we can't eliminate it. We're going to live in systems that have anxiety. But, and it's the condition that leaders are always operating in. So just to be aware of that, I find is liberating for some people because we think as leaders, maybe our responsibility is to have a non-anxious environment. Really, our responsibility is to be a less anxious presence, which is what we're going to talk about. And so the key issue is to notice, how am I relating to anxiety in the system and in myself, first of all? So let's talk about a systems lens here first. So much of the framework I'm going to use to talk about leadership today is it's based in Bowen family systems theory, which was developed by Dr. Murray Bowen. He was a psychiatrist in the 1950s who studied family systems and made observations about them that now have been applied widely in leadership and organizational contexts. So Bowen's central insight was that people don't function in isolation. We function as part of emotional systems. And when anxiety rises in a system, he observed some predictable patterns that emerge. So he observed that the relationships between members of a relational system are motivated by what he calls emotional processes. And two primary emotional processes that he observed in every relational system are the force for individuality and the force for togetherness. So in other words, the force to have individual agency and autonomy and independence, but also the force to be connected and to belong. And what I would say is, Bowen was observing a biblical reality. So I always think about the gospel as a reflection of reality. To me, the gospel tells us the story of what is real and what's ultimately true. And I think Bowen observed that human beings are created with dignity to be agents in the world. And we're created to live in community and connection with others. So what he observed is anxiety increases in a system when there's too much or too little of either one of those. So too much togetherness, too much individuality, not enough togetherness, not enough individuality. So you could think about that on a supervision scale. So too much togetherness would be what? Micromanagement. Be somebody always in all the details and not giving you any autonomy. Whereas too much individuality would be not enough guidance, not enough framework, not a job description. So often some kind of a change in the system upsets the equilibrium of the balance between individuality and togetherness. So for example, if there's new leadership, or if there's staff changes, or in the environment we live in today, if there are funding changes, any kind of change in the emotional equilibrium of a relational system, when there's increased anxiety, will upset these forces. So Bowen observed that there are 4 symptoms of increased anxiety in a system. Conflict, so people start arguing more. People are more easily offended, or there's more criticism of decisions. So that's the first symptom. Second symptom is something that he termed over-under functioning reciprocity. And what that means is some people in the system take too much responsibility for relationship, while other people take too little responsibility for relationship. The third symptom, distance. Some people withdraw from relationships or just avoid people or situations altogether. And then lastly, projection onto a third person, which is what we would identify as blaming others or gossip or going to a third person instead of directly to the person that you need to have a conversation with. So when we see these symptoms, often we default to what I would call individual thinking, which is we say, who is the problem here? We've got this conflict or we've got this gossip going around. Who is the problem? And what's wrong with this person? And how do we fix this behavior? How do we get this behavior to stop in the organization? Systems thinking, however, asks some different questions. It asks, what does this action or behavior tell us about how anxiety is moving through the system? And what patterns emerge when anxiety increases in our organization? What are the predictable patterns that we can observe in our organization when anxiety increases? And most importantly, how am I participating in that pattern as a leader? So this is what we mean by process, how anxiety is being managed and moved through the relational system. And that is happening below the surface. This is an invisible process happening in every one of your healthcare clinics, every relational system. And so when process goes examined, I just was talking to somebody about this morning, we have the same conversations over and over and over again. And we're like, why do we keep having this conversation? Because we haven't really dealt with the underlying emotional processes that are at work. We find ourselves carrying more responsibility when we don't deal with what's under the surface, or just feeling completely fatigued and reactive. Often, leadership identity takes shape when there's increased anxiety. We have often people jump in to resolve tension quickly. We call that the fixer. The stabilizer tries to smooth things over. The buffer tries to absorb pressure internally so that nobody else has to carry anything. The defender advocates forcefully for positions to try to make sure their agenda gets advanced. And the analyzer moves toward explanation or analysis. So what I'm describing here are basically identities that form around these impulses of reactivity. So they become these patterns of reactivity to try to fix things or to stabilize things. They become kind of part of our strategy, they become part of our way of operating in the world, and we take it on as part of our identity. Systems thinking, however, invites us to a different move. Instead of asking, how do we solve this? How do we fix this? We ask, what is this revealing about how the system is functioning under pressure? So, for example, I'm just going to give you an example of a hypothetical situation. So in an organization, a leader consistently steps in quickly in meetings, offering solutions, clarifying directions, even taking on responsibility for following up on action items. Over time, other people contribute less. Some people in the room feel relieved. Whew, glad she's got that. Glad he's got that. Other people disengage. From an individual lens, we might ask, why are they so controlling? Or why aren't these other people stepping up? But from a systems lens, what we notice is anxiety is rising. Responsibility is concentrating in one person. Other people are adapting by pulling back. No one person is the problem. The system is managing anxiety in a patterned way, and everyone is participating in that pattern. So what I love about systems theory is really it reflects the reality that each person in a system contributes to the anxiety in the system. And each person in the system has the capacity to contribute toward movement toward greater health and maturity. Leaders are in a particularly important role when it comes to influencing the system toward greater health and maturity, which brings us to differentiated leadership. So differentiation is not a communication skill or a leadership strategy. It's an internal capacity. It's the capacity to remain clear about who you are, what you're responsible for, and what you're committed to while staying in relationship when pressure is present. It sounds so easy on a PowerPoint slide. One way to think about it is self-definition. And I just was in a session on compassion fatigue, and he talked about this idea of self-differentiation as significant when we talk about contrasting compassion fatigue with empathy distress. So I highly encourage you to listen to that session as well. But this idea of self-definition means we know what belongs to us and we know what doesn't. We're clear about our purpose and our guiding principles. And we are able to tolerate the discomfort of staying connected without becoming absorbed or reactive. So often, when pressure rises, leaders are pulled toward one of two extremes. So on the right over there, fusion, over-connected. We feel we want to keep unity. We want everybody to agree. We take on more responsibility so that we try to keep things together. So we over-function. We try to get everybody together. Or we're pulled over here to distance where we disengage, where we detach, where we're like, I can't handle this anymore. I'm just going to stand back here and let other people take on these problems. Differentiation lives in the middle, where we're able to stay connected and hold on to our self. So, differentiated leaders care deeply. This isn't about not caring. We care deeply, but we don't allow emotions to determine our actions. So, in other words, we move from reacting to responding. So reacting looks like it's automatic, it's an impulse. So in biblical terms, this would be our flesh. This is just our automatic, and these reactions have been formed over time. I'll say more about that in a little bit. But it's an automatic impulse. And there's a God-given grace in our fight or flight impulse, right? So we need that to protect us from danger, right? But relationally, when that has become a means of protecting ourselves from pain, guess what? That inhibits our capacity to love. And so this automatic impulse has to be reflected on in our relational systems. And so reacting is very urgency driven. We got to do something now. I got to send that email now. I got to talk to this person now. If I don't do this in the next hour, things are not going to be good. I got to get this taken care of. It's focused on relief, and it's often shaped by others' emotions. It's often shaped by the pressure we feel to be what we think other people want us to be, or to do what we think other people want us to do. By contrast, responding is thoughtful. So it has allowed our amygdala to slow down and for our prefrontal cortex to come online and to think about our responses. It's principled, so it's rooted in our core purpose and our commitments. It's grounded in role clarity, knowing who we are and who we're not. We're creatures. We're not the creator. We are limited. And it's oriented toward long-term health. So one of the most counterintuitive ideas in this whole framework is that self-regulation, this idea of differentiation of self-regulation is leadership work. Often we think about leadership as getting other people to do what we want them to do. In reality, leadership is primarily about managing yourself and growing in your capacity to thoughtfully respond rather than emotionally react. At its core, differentiation is about anxiety tolerance. The more differentiated a leader is, the more anxiety they can tolerate without acting it out or passing it along. So instead of acting immediately, a differentiated leader clarifies what is theirs to carry and what isn't. They anchor in their purpose and guiding principles, and they tolerate the discomfort of others' uncertainty without rushing to relieve it. From this internal stance, whatever they say or do is going to be more grounded and proportionate to what's going on than if they impulsively react. Differentiation is not about the content of what you say, it's about the internal stance and posture before you say anything. For us as Christian leaders, this anchoring comes through our relationship with God, which empowers us to exercise self-control, which is a fruit of the Spirit. All three of these moves are part of a process of discerning how to respond rather than impulsively react. This posture, I would say, what I love about this framework of differentiation of self is, I did my thesis last year on differentiation of self as a reflection of cruciform shepherd leadership in Scripture. And to me, this posture enables us to actually love. Because when we are acting out of anxiety, we are acting mostly out of self-protection. And that is not a posture of love. And so if I really want to lay down my life for others, I first have to discern what does that actually look like and not just impulsively react. So let me slow this down and talk briefly about each one of these, and then I'm going to have Katie come up. So clarify. First, we pause long enough to clarify what actually belongs to us and what doesn't. So in times of pressure and anxiety, leaders feel the temptation and the tendency to absorb everyone's concern, to resolve the discomfort, or to carry responsibility that rightly belongs elsewhere. Internally, the work of clarifying sounds something like this. I'm responsible for setting direction and maintaining clarity, not for eliminating everyone's anxiety or answering every question right now. Nothing external changes during this phase of clarifying, but as leaders, we're quietly reestablishing appropriate responsibility rather than being swept away by the tide of anxiety into taking on overfunctioning or distancing it by underfunctioning. So it's not withdrawal, it is role clarity. We're establishing role clarity. Next, we anchor in our core commitments and our sense of purpose. So under pressure, it's easy to get pulled away from who we really want to be and what we really are committed to. Differentiation involves returning to that deeper anchor. So internally, the leader, we might ask, what principles need to guide my response, even if they don't relieve tension quickly? So I'll just pause here and say, this is a place for reflection outside of these tension moments. In the times when you're not in a tension or a crisis situation, this is a time to consider what are the principles that I want to guide my responses and my relational interactions. This step slows urgency and reorients us toward our long-term commitments rather than short-term relief. It doesn't provide an immediate solution, but it provides steadiness. So it allows us to get to some solid ground internally. And then the last step of tolerating is the hardest because we tolerate the discomfort of not being able to be everything everybody wants us to be and not being able to fix everything that's broken. So it involves the capacity to allow others to feel uncertain or to feel frustrated or to feel impatient without immediately trying to make those feelings go away. We allow people to be where they are. Internally, it might sound like I can stay present to this tension without acting it out, without reacting. I don't need to fix this feeling in order to lead responsibly. This anxiety tolerance is a capacity to be emotionally present without being driven by urgency. And again, this is where we need the grace of the Holy Spirit. My experience is this is not just a sheer act of our will. This is an empowered movement of the Spirit that our will is involved. We engage, we cooperate with the Spirit, and we ask for the grace to hold fast in these moments of tension. So none of these steps, I'm not giving you like some miracle cure here. This is not like some dramatic or even visible activity, these three phases that I just talked about, clarifying, anchoring, and tolerating. No one in the system probably is even going to know these are going on for you as a leader. But internally, it shifts us from being driven by pressure to leading from principle. So we've talked about anxiety, how it moves through the system, and the capacity of differentiated leadership. What I want you to hear now is what this looks like in real leadership, not in theory, but in practice. Katie Richards is the CEO of Siloam Health in Nashville, and she's going to share how differentiated leadership has shaped her leadership in a season of anxiety and pressure at Siloam. And as she shares, I want you to listen for where was pressure present, how did anxiety show up in the system, and what shifted in her leadership. So, here you go. I'm going to tag team.
Okay. It occurred to me when I was sitting there that 2 years ago I got asked, when I had just become CEO, to speak at the executive session. Can y'all hear me? Are we good? Okay, great. And I stood up in front of everyone and confessed all the ways I felt I was falling short as a CEO. And now I'm going to sit up and confess to you guys again how I fell short. Also, just want you to know, separate instance. So not the same material. We got material for years in leadership. You know what I'm saying? Great. So when I became the CEO of Siloam, it's 2.5, I guess almost 3 years ago now, we were coming through a really significant period of transition at our organization. We have very low transition at our org. So we're 35 years old. I'm the third CEO in those 35 years. So our CEO was leaving, who had been with the org in some form for 24 years. Our CMO, who had been in that role for 17 years, was retiring. We had a COO who left, and then I was leaving my position and having to hire the chief development officer. So there was a lot of transition. On top of that, our board was incredibly thoughtful and thorough in how they hired a CEO, which meant it took 8 months to do that. And so we had a long period of time where Morgan, our former CEO, wasn't like making decisions because he wanted the next CEO to make decisions. So then I come into that role and I've inherited a lot of that, like, let's wait. And then I know I have to hire these 3 positions in these 3 areas. And yet there's all this tension and change that's wanted and decisions that need to be made. And yet I know if we're going to have healthy teams and do this in a way that is going to respect new leadership, I've got to wait to hire the new person and onboard them. So I'm sitting in front of a team that in particular, I think had felt pretty unheard in the organization. And I don't think they're wrong about that. I think that they hadn't been heard as well as they could have been for quite a while. And yet I was going to sit in front of them for another 6 months and say, I hear you. I'm not going to be doing anything until we get a new chief medical officer, because I really want that person, because these were big things like structural changes and leadership changes that I did not want to do ahead of a new CMO. So there was just a lot of, and I did not realize, a lot of anxiety in the system. As someone who likes change, change does not produce the kind of anxiety in me that it does in some other folks. And so I was just a little bit out of tune with that. The other element that was pretty significant during this time is I was a completely different style leader than our former CEO. He's a physician, he's brilliant. I mean, he went to Princeton, Vanderbilt Medical School, he had a whole wall full of degrees that I had to put art up on because I barely have an undergrad from a directional state school. But I'm just gonna tell you like it is. I think what's kindness is let's have a conversation. That's probably not gonna happen. It's probably gonna be a year before we can revisit that. And turns out that doesn't always feel great on the other side of it. And so we also under-narrated all the change, the style change, how that would feel. Things I could not have named in the moment that I have learned in retrospect. So we had a lot of tension brewing in one team, brewing in me towards this team, I was aware that they were frustrated. I thought I was being kind by just being really honest with them that like, yeah, it's going to be another 6 months before we likely make that decision. Let me, because I would have all the facts, make the decision you want to make. But the reality is I also reached a point with this team once I hired the new leader, in that I felt like I kept hearing the same complaints, the same conversations. And then I felt like I kept trying to give the feedback I knew to give and meet them how I knew to meet them. And in me, that rose to a point where I was just done. I was done with that team. I was like, I am over you all. I didn't say this to them. I do have a little bit of health as a leader. But I couldn't have told you this in the moment. I distanced from them. I stopped going around them as much. I was like, I've hired the person. By this time I hired the person, I'm gonna let them deal with it. She would come to me, I'd be like, I've already addressed that. We're not addressing that. I became a stone wall. And that was just true. That's what I did. And so there came an event in our organization where I was brought face to face with some really uncomfortable feedback about how I was being perceived. And it was feedback given in a way that you weren't aware the person you were giving the feedback about was going to hear it. So it was real honest feedback. And for me on several levels, that was hard. These were people I had worked with at that point till about 11 years. I felt hurt. And yet, they had tried to get my attention other ways. And I think the Lord knew. He was like, Katie, listen, this is the only way I could really shake you and get you to understand. This is broken beyond what you're able to bring to it to fix it. And so that's when I realized, hey, we need some outside help. I called our former CEO. I said, here's what happened. Here's what I'm feeling. He said, have you thought about Debbie? And I was like, oh, perfect, Debbie. So met with Debbie, brought Debbie in, kind of gave her the overview, and she did really thoughtful interviews with that team, with me, and with others. And, I was expecting like, it's mainly that team. You're right, Katie. Oh, guys, that's not what came back. It was, hey, yes, there's some stuff over here to address. I'll address that with them. But hey, we need to talk about you. We need to talk about how you distanced, how you abdicated some of your responsibilities in your leadership, and I need you to kind of own these things. And when we had that, I didn't love all of that feedback. It wasn't like I didn't like walk out of there. I walked out of there saying lots of words in my head that I will never say to Debbie Tacke out loud. But I really had to sit with it, because if I have brought in a trusted, wise individual, what I do not have the luxury to do is to dismiss her wise counsel on that. Now, I didn't agree 100% with some of your interpretations on things, and that's okay. But the core of it was like, yes. So I've done a lot of work one-on-one with Debbie through the other leader that we have hired and how she leads the team. And I have noted, and myself, I have worked towards moving towards that team, physical presence, realizing that my presence matters with people as the CEO. I think I kind of want to downplay that, because I'm like, it's just me. But it matters to me to be present. It matters to them that I am present. And then we have been having a really healthy dialogue where I think I'm able to sit in relationship more kind of across the organization. We have also seen through the leader of that team, her movement towards differentiation and how we're seeing people on that team change as well. It's been so incredible that we actually rolled it out with our entire senior leadership team a couple of weeks ago, because the language that we're adopting, the framework that we're able to think through, the way that I now see it in other teams and leaders, it's really been transformative for us.
We apologize to you that are listening to this crackling on the recording. Thanks very much, Katie. So what Katie just described is a work. It's a process. This is a lifelong process of differentiated leadership. The shift is not simply a strategy. It's not a book you read and learn some leadership strategy. It's how we relate to ourselves and then therefore what we do with what we learn about ourselves. So I want to just say one thing about differentiation and that is that our capacity for differentiation doesn't just start in our leadership roles. It's formed much earlier in the emotional systems that we grow up in. So in our families of origin, we all learned implicitly, not consciously. Nobody sat down with us with a manual and said, no, here's the guidelines on how we're going to handle conflict. But we learned implicitly about how closeness or disagreement or responsibility or anxiety were handled. We learned what happened when tension increased in the system. We learned whether it was safer to speak or to manage or to withdraw or to smooth things over. So those patterns weren't chosen. They were adaptive in those original systems. They helped us function in the systems we were part of. So when we step into leadership roles, those early capacities and patterns don't disappear. Under pressure, they usually reassert themselves, not because we're regressing to childhood, but because anxiety pulls us toward what's familiar. So the good news is that differentiation is not fixed. While it's formed in our family systems, it can be developed and strengthened over time through awareness, practice, and support, which is really the whole of my life work really right now, is to help leaders grow in this capacity. Because it is the capacity to love. The goal is to increase our internal range of tolerating anxiety and pressure so that we can then discern what love looks like instead of acting out of fear. So differentiation, it's a dynamic process. So I teach about this, I work in this all the time, and it's always being tested. And you can ask my husband, I think I know about this, and then we have a hard conversation, and all of a sudden I'm not so differentiated anymore. So it's a dynamic process that's always being tested and challenged. So I just want to say that, go gently as we talk about this today. We're doing a very abbreviated overview of this today. My initial workshop on this is usually 90 minutes to 2 hours, and then there's a follow-up about navigating conflict for another couple hours. So we're doing a very high-level introduction. And one of the biggest parts of the first step, I guess one of the first steps in this process is to know your default reaction under pressure or under anxiety. So becoming aware of what do I do in those moments when anxiety goes up? What's my immediate automatic impulse? So I want you to take a minute to reflect on these two questions. When leadership pressure increases for me, what do I notice happening internally? Maybe in your body, what happens for you physically, but also what happens internally for you. And then what do you tend to do next? Do you take on more? Do you pull back? Do you try to manage others' emotions or reactions? Do you talk to someone else instead of directly addressing the issue, or something else? So you could think about this chart really. Do you tend to go over here toward distance, what Katie described, or do you tend to go over toward over-connected and wanting to make sure everybody stays together and you don't lose connection with anybody? So what I want you to do is I want you to take just a minute to reflect on that. So kind of a minute of silence to reflect on that. And then I'm going to have you just turn to the person next to you. We're just going to pair up, and if there happen to be 3, that's fine, 2 or 3. And I want you to share what your reflections are about these questions. So take a minute of silence, and then I'll cue you to pair up. So just take a minute to reflect on it yourself before we pair up. Okay, let's come back together. Y'all ready? So much to talk about anxiety. We could be here all day, I know. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for participating in that. I really, I would love to have people have a chance to share, but we are going to be short on time, so we won't do that. But I want to just summarize what we've talked about today, which is that anxiety is an inevitable part of every relational system, every leadership system. And that systems develop patterns over time about how they deal with anxiety and pressure. And leadership begins with how we manage ourselves within those patterns, How am I going to respond within these anxious patterns? So differentiated leadership is the capacity to stay clear and grounded and connected in the presence of that pressure. And for us as Christian leaders, that capacity is not something we generate on our own. It's sustained through our relationship with God. Our life of prayer anchors and empowers this work of differentiation. And for me, I can just testify basically from my own experience, the practice of getting quiet enough to even notice my anxiety. If you would have asked me if I had anxiety, I would have said no, absolutely not. I'm not an anxious person. I am. We all have anxiety, and I have more than I thought I had. All I had to do was get married to have a mirror reflect how much I have anxiety. Driving with somebody else, that makes me anxious. So I think the question for us is, Rick asked last night in the executive summit, he asked about what keeps us from reading scripture. And so I would ask a similar question to us today. What keeps us from getting quiet and being still with our own heart so that we can then engage with God about the reality of our own heart? That is a lifelong process. That's not a skill we master. That's a grace we ask for. And it's a way of life that we enter into. And we ask God to give us, to empower us to continue in that way of life. So we learn to notice our reactivity and to pause and regain clarity, to anchor in our core commitments and principles, and to tolerate the discomfort that comes from remaining connected while we hold on to ourselves. So this is the work of learning to love. This is the work of Christian formation, frankly. And it's the work of Christian leadership. So this will be a little bit of a mind bender, but it just blew my mind when I heard somebody say this. Your greatest contribution to your organizations and to every relational system you live in is your own personal growth and your life of prayer. More than anything you do, you can't do anything if those two relationships are not rooted. Often we think, the main thing I got to do is get out here and do a lot of stuff for other people. I got to help all these people that have needs. Jesus said, I'm the vine, you're the branches. Unless you abide in me, you can't do anything. You can't bear any fruit. So our activity without attending to our life, our interior life with God, is like trying to glue grapes on a grapevine. It's not real, and it's not sustainable. So now we have time for a few questions. Katie, if you want to come up here, people may have questions for you too. So we have 5 minutes left for some questions. Perfect. Yes.
Do you have any books you recommend that talk more about the differentiation, exercises, maybe stuff like that?
Absolutely. So a real kind of initial book might be Pete Scazzero's book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, and he's got a companion book, Emotionally Healthy Leadership. And then there's a book that's really about congregational life, but it's a really good book. It's called Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times by Peter Steinke. And he kind of goes through these Bowen principles and applies them to community life. So both of those would be books that I would recommend. Yeah. Other questions for me or Katie? Yes. Sure. I don't know. Yes, if you want to come up afterwards and give me your email, I'll email them to you, the slides. Or is that the best way? I don't know. I don't know how CCHF does that.
It's not if you email Woody, he'll give you a link of how you can upload it.
Okay, I'll email Woody and I will get it uploaded. Yes, to the Whova app. Yes.
You were saying that you were recording it. Are we able to have access to the recording? You want to hear it?
The recording? Is it going to be on the Whova app? The recordings, are they going to be on the Whova app? It'll take a few weeks, but it'll be available through the CCHF website. Yes.
What was the biggest distractor for you stepping into the new
The biggest distractor. In what way? What do you mean by distractor?
So we're like, with this pressure and like stepping into this, you being a third one in the last 35 years.
Seriously.
How were you able to withhold like the confidence and not allow like maybe getting in your own way?
Yeah, fake it till you make it. I mean, just quite honestly. And like, just recognizing that there was a really long process and the Lord kind of worked it out. And so whether or not I felt adequate, other people felt I was adequate, didn't really matter because the Lord had me in the seat. But it was a lot of having to come back to that.
Others? Yeah.
You notice that I was just like discontent or stress or whatever I'm seeing, but you know, you really can't pinpoint like where it's coming from exactly, like what's the first kind of strategy that you would use to try to
Hire Debbie.
I mean, you know, the slide I had that said this is all below the surface, these are things that people usually aren't talking about. And so part of it involves asking good questions and being willing to be curious and not in a hurry to fix something. So being willing to sit down and ask, you know, I've observed some of these things and I'm just curious. We know anxiety is on so we know anxiety is probably at work. So one of the things I've found that's helpful for leaders is to acknowledge their own anxiety. I know I've felt anxious about some of these things lately, and I'm curious, I wonder if you've experienced any anxiety and how that's manifested for you. So yeah, I think sharing your own vulnerability as a leader is good. Yeah.
you say that you got all your team to do the training?
We started with the team that kind of where the core issue was between me and them. But because we've used it for a year now and I've seen how valuable it is, we're now using it with our senior leadership team.
Yes. Yeah, that's my work. So my organization is Principled Leadership Coaching and Consulting out of Nashville. And so this is what I do. I work with faith-based organizations and ministries around this issue of differentiation of self. Yeah. So yeah. So I've got business cards if you want to come up afterwards. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Once you're able to kind of slow down and guard against that reactive, visual reactive response to managing emotions or whatever, at which point then do you, or what would your recommended next steps be in terms of like managing emotions that might still be necessary and like tackling the problem itself?
I'm not sure I understand. Do you understand this? I'm not sure I know what you're asking.
Are you saying like once the leader has gotten centered, then how do you then show up with the team that's not as centered?
You've done all that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's everything that we talked about today in terms of, and a little bit of what I just said in terms of being curious. So you learn to manage your own reactivity and you're grounded in in the leader that you want to be. So I often ask that question, what kind of leader do you want to be in this situation? And being curious about what's happening. Often you can't do it in a group context to begin with. Often it needs to start with individuals, because in a group context with a leader, if there's a high level of anxiety, people are probably not going to be as honest. So it might need to start with some individual conversations with other people in the organization. Without knowing more, I can't really probably say more than that, but I think that's probably the next step. Yeah. Yes. Part of it, but part of what I'll say is wherever you're at on this continuum, wherever you're at. So if you have a tendency toward distance, so Katie talked about she had a tendency toward distance. So her movement is toward greater connection, right? So part of her growth is to, when she feels anxiety, instead of distancing, move toward connection, which is why I had you guys just do that pairs exercise, because knowing your default, if you have a tendency to overconnect and take too much responsibility, part of your movement is to step back and to allow others to walk into that space. So knowing your default tendency is a big part of what informs your movement. So that's part of why she moved that way. Yeah.
Any helpful practices or spiritual disciplines to help with the self-differentiation?
Contemplative prayer has been a big practice for me, which is really just slowing down long enough to be with my heart. It's not intercessory prayer. Sometimes it's lectio, meditating on a passage of scripture, but most of the time it's just being with the reality of my life. So this is a big thing I talk about is often our reactivity is because we are unwilling to accept reality as it is. So contemplative prayer basically says, I'm going to just be with reality as it is with you, God. Jesus, come into my reality, and I'm going to weep over this, or I'm going to tell you how angry I am, or I'm going to rejoice, whatever it is, but I'm going to be with the reality instead of railing against it and trying to figure out how I get it to be different. I discern with you, what do you want? So that's been huge. Yeah. I think we're out of time. Right. Yeah. Next year for that. Yeah. Thank you all for your attentiveness. We're out of time, but I'll be up here for a few minutes if you want to come visit. Thanks.